Welcome to our conversation on organizational culture. Organizational culture and identity are paired together because really they go hand in hand. Organizations with strong and positive cultures tend to have higher levels of identification with mission, with work, with colleagues, etc. Your textbook heavily borrows from the work of Harry Trice and Janice Beyer in how they define and discuss organizational culture. I had the good fortune of having the very last PhD course that Jan Beyer taught before she passed away, and I am so glad that I did because, it's funny. She was an old school academic. She expected a lot from her students. She taught in the School of Management at the University of Texas. And so a classmate of mine and I, in communication, took the class together. And so when I say old school, what I mean was that she was kind of a female version of House. The TV show. She was blunt. She was brutal. And if you were stupid, you were told you were stupid, very deservedly so. But the thing is that she challenged everybody. So if you spoke, you better be able to defend what you say and know what you're talking about. I like that, and I learned a lot from her not just because of her style that I appreciated, but because she's really one of the genuine sources of foundational knowledge in organizational culture. So this is Trice and Beyer's perspective on organizational culture. What they were trying to do in their work was find ways that were practical, but also artful in how they approached organizational culture that really tried to encapsulate it in a way that you could study and that you could look at. So our lecture is going to have two parts. One is really the background and the definitional components of it, and the second is the look at the forms, which you'll understand in a little bit, but the forms of organizational culture. So let's start with a brief history. In a lot of ways, the study of organizational culture began in the 1930s with the Hawthorne studies. Now, some of you may have heard of the term the Hawthorne effect. That really is descriptive of one of the outcomes of this study, that when people are watched and observed, they tend to behave better. Not a surprise there. But that wasn't what was interesting from an organizational cultural perspective. After the Hawthorne researchers found out the Hawthorne effect, functionally, they continued with their research, and what they identified were three types of social relationships that happen in a workplace. The first are the technical relationships. So people and workers in any given workplace will talk about the work that they do. They build a relationship based on how they have to function to help one another out, what they need to do to get the work done. That's an important social relationship because if you're on friendly, positive terms, it makes it a lot easier to get your work accomplished. The second relationship were the social components of the relationship. This is the office happy hour. This is identifying who hangs out with who has lunch together. All of the what sometimes gets referred to as the office politics. But the researchers also identified this as an important component of the social relationships in an organizational setting. Understanding who relates to who hangs out with who, all of those kinds of things help us to really understand how an organizational hangs together. So you have the functional work relationships, you have the relationships outside of work, and then you also have the ideological relationships. This is really where the study of culture came in. When we're talking about the ideological relationships, we're talking about the sense of teamwork, the sense of belonging, the sense of who we are as an organization. So in the 1930s, as a result of the Hawthorne studies, we really had our foundations of organizational culture. Those senses of the ideological were where the culture came in. In the 1950s and 60s, this came along in the form of institutionalization. What researchers discovered and were interested in was the focus on values in the organization, basically trying to define the meaning of work. I thought that these cartoons had displayed a couple of nice points. So, on the left one, I wish that my life had more meaning. Essentially, one of the important components that the researchers of the 50s and 60s found out was that people derived part of their meaning of who they were as a human being, but also what it meant to go to work every day from their office, from the workplace, from the people around them. So if you were satisfied with your working environment, you probably were going to be a better worker, a better employee. And this makes a lot of sense. So this is where this notion of values in the workplace comes in. What are your ethics? What are the corporate ethics? These types of questions were important ones that were being asked in the 1950s and 60s. So it's not, before that, we really hadn't thought about that. It was a job. You went to work, you earned your way, and you went home. We always knew that it defined a part of who we were. But this really started to formalize the study of the values in organizations, and not just that the people have, but really looking at the fact that organizations themselves come to have values. So a part of this in the 1950s and 60s was connecting political and social agendas on the part of organizations, not only with the management functions and with the basic work, but with how people engage at different levels. So this graphic, I thought, does a nice job of showing how the intersection of any organization's environment comes in. And this was one of the big innovations in the study of organizations during the 1950s and 60s, was to start to ask questions about how all of these publics come together and affect the interactions, affect how the company chooses to do business, and really how people within the companies begin to engage with one another. It shouldn't be surprising, because at this time we had the joy of the communist scare. And so politics and a social agenda became very much a part of almost every organizational environment because of what was happening in our broader society. From there, the study of organizational culture became formalized and really helped to develop. In the 1970s and 80s, we saw a lot of formalization of the study. Trice and Beyer did a lot of their formational work, statistically oriented, in analyzing and organizing the nature of organizational culture, figuring it out. So one of the things that I've talked about is where we are with the study of organizational crisis, that we're really in our early times. That's what the 50s, 60s, and 70s were for organizational culture. They were trying to figure out what it meant, how it engaged in the environment, all of those kinds of things. So when we look at organizational culture, I think one of the important questions to ask is, why study organizational culture? This quotation from Kenneth Burke, I think, sums it up very nicely. That humans build their cultures nervously loquacious on the edge of an abyss. So what does this mean? I think that this is talking about a couple of things. First, that culture really is about teetering on the edge of the unknown. We deal with, in organizations and in our personal lives every day, a lot of unknowns. The ways that we make sense of the world, our worldviews, how we cope with things, is very much a part of where we grow up, the societies that we live in, and everything like that. So at an organizational level, the culture helps us interact, and it helps us manage what comes at us in a workplace just as well. So why study organizational culture is the same reason that we should study cultures in a broader sense. It helps us to understand, predict, and determine what is useful in our organizational settings. So one of the key functions that organizational culture does is it helps us to cope with uncertainty. So it guides us to really expressing our beliefs, our values, and our norms. What is it that it means to be in your organization? What is okay in your organization? Yeah, this little graphic came from a workshop where what's okay? So what is it that you do as a part of your routine activities in an organization? Part of this is governed by your organization's overall values and what it is that your organization wants you to do. So it helps us cope with the uncertainty of how should we do our work, everything from that very basic level to how do we integrate into a global economic environment. A second reason that we should study organizational culture is that it helps us manage chaos. And because I love South Park, I love this visual. But the chaos of our work environments is growing exponentially as organizations have to engage with stakeholders in ways that they never thought, in terms of social media, the explosion of a genuinely global society because of the ways that we can interconnect. All of these things make doing our basic jobs in an organizational setting even more complex. Issues of organizations investigating their own employees. Before you get a job, if you haven't paid attention to what your Facebook looks like, to what your digital footprint looks like, all of these kinds of things matter to organizations. So the culture, though, asks how important is it in our organization that we have employees who represent our ideal. What that ideal is the organization's culture. So that's another reason to study organizational culture. But then we come to defining it. Trice and Beyer argue that culture is any social system arising from a network of shared ideologies, consisting of two components: the substance associated with those ideologies and the forms that organizational culture takes place. Now, this notion of the network of shared ideologies suggests that culture isn't something that is simply transmitted. Leaders don't solely create a culture, and they don't just dole it out to their employees in a way that is just a broadcast message that everybody listens to. It's built on a number of relationships. So certainly people with power in organizations help to define and determine what culture is, but it's important to understand that it goes beyond that it is based on a number of relationships. And then these ideologies communicate norms and values, and the way that we see them is in terms of the forms. This is how we practice. This is how we engage. This is what's evident when we go through our organizational lives. The way that Jan Beyer explained this is that our ideology is something that isn't tangible. It's a set of beliefs. It's what we value. It's our underlying kind of core assumptions about what it means to be in an organization. We can't really hear, see, smell, touch, or taste any of that. So what she and Trice argued is that we can't ever really directly tap what an ideology is. But what we can tap are the forms that ideology takes on. So for every value, there is an expression of that value. And the forms are those concrete manifestations of what the organization believes in, what it tries to articulate, and how it really sees itself. That's the important thing to understand about what culture is. It is that it is a matching of values or the ideologies with the practical, visible, direct ways that we engage in our organizational realities or in our social realities more broadly. So the first component, the substance, the ideology. So this is a shared system of beliefs, values, and norms. Let me give you an example from Southwest Airlines. Their beliefs or their values, their norms are, as stated, to have employees who are dedicated, mission-oriented, close-knit, and high-spirited. One way to compete is to make work fun. Now, this is fairly high-minded. This isn't saying this is how they will do their job every day, but this is what they're trying to aim for. So when you think of one easy way to start to identify an organization's values, look at their mission statements. Look at the espoused goals. Look at the kind of high-minded notions that they try and communicate. The very vague, abstract kinds of things that they try and communicate. That's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the substance. Now, we talk about this in culture all the time. What is someone's value? Well, what does it mean, for example, in life to have family values? Well, shoot, that depends on a lot of our definitions of what a family is, what it means to support that family. And so there's a lot of variation. This is one of the tricky things about culture, is that ideology in and of itself is kind of hard to nail down. It can mean a lot of things. That's why we look at the second component, the forms, the observable ways that members of a culture can express their cultural ideas. So using the Southwest Airlines examples again, a couple of ways that these values manifest themselves. Once a quarter, and they still do it, management, the upper level kind of folks, go work as real employees. They do the baggage. They are ticket agents, they're flight attendants. It's kind of this is really the original undercover boss. They weren't undercover. Everyone knew that it was management's day to come down. But they did the work, and they got to experience what it was on the line. Herb Kelleher, that's the guy in red in the middle on that left picture there. Herb Kelleher's argument was that if management doesn't have some experience in all of the jobs that everyday folks do, they're not really going to understand how to manage the organization. Likewise, what this does, though, is connects the management with the folk. They get to see them, they get to hang out with them, they get to chat with them. Now, another example of making work fun, and I don't know if they still do this. For a long time, though, every Friday in Dallas, which is Southwest Airlines' major hub, there's a cookout. They get together, they barbecue, and they really just, they make sure that everyone has an opportunity, whoever's there, maintenance to pilots to ticket agents, doesn't matter who it is, they make sure that they have an opportunity to check in. And, this is something that a company doesn't have to do by any stretch, but it's something that, for Herb Kelleher, articulated and were a way of showing his employees that he had a commitment to the values that he ascribed to. So this is really the interplay between the substance and the forms of an organizational culture. So when we look at the characteristics of culture, when we start to break it down a little more finely, the first of those, the first of those characteristics is that it's collective. Like I mentioned, there is no one person who creates a culture. Leaders certainly contribute and they can guide, and especially if there's someone like Herb Kelleher, they're a charismatic individual. So the more charismatic, certainly the more influence they have. But what it means to be collective is that every single culture, whether we're talking in a single organization, whether we're talking in industry, or whether we're talking in national culture, is produced through the interactions of its members. That in order to have an identity, it's made up of a whole lot of other folks. So that's an important first component to keep in mind. That one of the key characteristics of culture is that it is collective. Second, it is emotionally charged. Because we're talking about values, because we're talking about things that people care about, This is something that isn't exactly without contention. I put up this picture based on the 2008 election and a lot of the kind of wranglings that we had about what it means to be a real American. And this is really what we're talking about, because our larger American cultural kind of contention right now about who are we as a country, organizations also go through. That when they come to critical points, when the organization's first getting started, when they have experienced major calamity or major crisis, these are questions that organizations start to have. What do we really care about? Who are we as an organization? So you can bet that BP, for example, is having those kinds of conversations as in the wake of the oil spill. Every organization at different points in time are going to have those kinds of conversations. So being emotionally charged means that people actually care. When we're talking about what does it mean to be here, a lot of people have opinions on this. And so you can imagine that there is a lot of argument about who we are, what it means, and what we should expect from that. And that's an important component of culture that you have to understand and take a look at. A third important component of culture is that it is historically based. I use this Disney example in just the animation. Look at Mickey Mouse of the that would have been, I think, 1920s, 1930s. And then look at the animation today. What's important, though, is even though we're looking at, that's Monsters Incorporated, I think. Anyhow, when we're looking at these amazing CGI graphics and all this kind of stuff, we have to understand that didn't just happen. Likewise, organizational culture doesn't just happen. What did people do at the founding? How did they define themselves? That matters a lot. And then over time, you don't really get away from that. There are elements, even if there is a direct rejection of what an organization used to be, that's an important part of telling the story of what an organization is. Culture is the sum total of its interactions, since from the time that the organization began through the current time. So it is most definitely historically based. Next, it is symbolic. Cultures express meaning. These are just kind of a collection of different logos, which are themselves important symbols for organizations. But why these symbols? Why the imagery? What is it the organization's trying to communicate about itself? Both externally and internally. This is the thing, that the external image that's communicated is something that also has to be authentic in order for it to really work. Organizations themselves are what Jan called meaning factories. That you can't help but have meaning when you're working in an organization. That what you do on a daily basis really comes to represent who you think you are as an organization. So if you slack on an everyday basis, what does that say about the organization that you work for? Apple Think Different is about the notion of innovation. I'm not the biggest fan of Apple Mac in the world, but what they do is they think up cool new ideas. I like Sony products better, but Sony isn't that innovative. They just take stuff that other organizations do, and then they perfect it. So as a consumer, I like that better. But without the innovation there, you really wouldn't find a lot of the perfection that comes later. So what is it that the organization expresses both externally and internally is really about the organization, and being in organizations being inherently symbolic. Fifth, Organizations and organizational cultures are dynamic. The only thing constant is change is an old adage, but it's most definitely true. And there's a number of characteristics of what it actually means to be dynamic. First, one of the reasons that culture is dynamic is because communication is imperfect. So, for instance, if we say that we value hard work, that's a bit ambiguous and a bit vague. How that gets interpreted, how that gets communicated is going to depend on, for example, a manager. What it means to be hardworking is going to vary from manager to manager, from experience to experience. And so the fact that we label things, the fact that we have slogans, that we have a set of values that get enacted in a real world setting is done imperfectly. So over time, the changes that can come about because of the imperfections in culture matter a lot. Second, and along these lines, the behavioral expectations will vary. You all have certainly experienced that, pardon the snorkeling of my dog. You all have experienced that just in a master's program, but I'm sure you've also experienced it in your workplaces when you have manager changes or you're the new manager and you come in and you have folks with a set of expectations and you hear that, but that's not how we've done it before. It's a frustrating thing when you're a new manager in an organization and they say, well, that's not what we did before. Well, no kidding, Sparky. Expectations vary. But over time, with that variance, you come to really adapt an organization's culture. It can change because of personality changes based on those behavioral expectations. Third, one of the reasons it changes is that culture is taken for granted. We just assume that we know what an organization means and what it means to work there. But what it means to me may not be what it means to another person. So because a lot of times we don't think about our missions, we just assume that everyone's operating from the same understanding of what the mission, the values, and the goals are. Over time, that's likely to change. We certainly see that in cultures. So even, my example from a few minutes ago, family values, what that means, we can toss around the word family values, but what it really can mean is going to vary depending on the person. We understand that it's typically talking about a very traditional nuclear family. Yet that's not really what all of the connotations suggest either. So this is why our identities and our ideologies can change over time. Fourth, symbols are imprecise. They're a shorthand way to visually represent or socially represent what an organization is. But it's not like, you toss up this symbol of an organization, the Red Cross, for instance, and it's going to mean the same thing to everyone who sees it. A lot of it's going to come because people bring in their own assumptions about it. And that the prevalence of symbols in organizations makes it subject to change because of that imprecision. But along those lines, we all bring baggage to our organizations. When we start a new job, we bring with it the expectations and the sum total of our experiences. And so it's like when we start a new relationship. The people that we date and the people that we marry are dating and married to a whole long line of people who came before them. So how we are in that relationship is the sum total of all of our lived experience to that point. The same is true in an organizational setting. When we enter an organization, we have all of the expectations of how we have always done the job, how we think the job ought to be done, things like that. That can cause genuine shift in the way that an organization operates, what it means to be in that organization, because of the baggage that we all bring with it. So what this really suggests then is a final characteristic, that organizational cultures themselves are inherently fuzzy. Within any organization, you're going to find contradictions, paradox, ambiguity, and confusion. If you're in an organization and you don't hear conflicting stories, frankly, I'd be suspect. That everyone tells the same story about what it means to be in the organization probably means that they're aware of paying lip service. When you start to dig deeper, that's where you start to really see that the organizations themselves, there's no really clear outline for what it means to be in any particular organization. It's going to depend on who you talk to, when you talk to them, and frankly, what kind of a mood that they're in. There's going to be threads of similarity. There are going to be big picture things that remain constant. But the question of who's really an American is really kind of, that's what we're talking about. It's everyone, it's no one, and they're both right. So this is the type of thing that makes organizational culture a challenge. But it also makes it really interesting as a field of examination. So the next thing, after looking at the characteristics, we need to look at the consequences of culture. That is, we have to answer the so what question. Why bother studying it? We started there, and we're going to revisit that issue again. So like I talked about before, culture helps us manage collective uncertainty. It gives us a storyline to follow. It gives us something to hold on to in the wake of the strange, the new, the unpredictable. It tells us how we should react. And that's an important feature. Culture gives us something concrete that we can talk about in terms of what our organizations are doing. Second, culture helps to create social order. We get a lot of, let me backtrack a little bit. Think about any organization that you're in. There are written rules. There certainly are. And then there's the way that it really works. When I was at the Air Force Academy, this was probably the most interesting component of getting to know military culture, is there's the 8,250,000,000 rules that are written down. And then there's the way that the place really operates. So even in highly organized, highly centralized, and very hierarchically structured organizations, what culture does is give you the sense of what actually matters. Who do you have to go to? Who do you talk to? Who don't you talk to? What's okay and what is not? If you go to an organization, anytime that you walk in new to an organization, just ask someone, so what does it mean to work here? Now, people a lot of the times will just tell you a story. There's some very cool organizational cultural research done with narratives where the researchers just walk in and they ask the question, tell me what it means to work here. After you talk to 10, 15 different employees, what you find is that there's a common set of stories that people tell in order to respond to that question. Because it's an indirect way to explain what does it really matter around here? Well, who do you talk to? What do you do? What don't you do? So culture is a really important component because it tells us our rules and what's expected of us beyond just the little pieces of paper that are written down. But it also creates continuity. It tells us what is important enough to carry on through time. You know, it's not just that there are great little ceremonies and we all kind of get the warm, fuzzy kumbaya feeling from organizational culture. But no matter who changes, whether it's people that change, whether it's job functions that change, whether it's economic realities that change, what we hold on to is that sense of sameness. Now, of course, the organizational culture itself is always in flux and always changing, but there are likely to be very strong central values within an organization that stay the same over time. This is where we get our continuity. This is how we know that even when bosses and personnel change, that we know what to expect out of it. That's one of the genuine values of organizational culture. And then, relatedly, it creates identity and commitment. Identity and commitment come in all of these areas. So what we do, the choices we make, our values and our beliefs, the way that we look when we go to work. You know, is it you have a very formal office, but you have casual Fridays? What do the people at your work look like? Is it a fairly mixed organization, and how is that in reflection of your community at large? What practices and habits are there a common set of hobbies? Are there things that people get together and do? You know, is this a company that is fairly family-oriented, or is it really that people spend a lot of time together, as in the company itself? What kinds of interests? What do people put in their office spaces? All of these things really help you to understand. If you look at everything that's on someone's desk, if you look at how the group as a whole dresses and act, you start to understand what is the company's or the organization's identity. And then likewise, the commitment component is, do they like it? There's something positive there about the identity. That gives you a sense of job satisfaction. So culture helps to create that identity and commitment. A strong culture has a lot of good identity and has a lot of commitment involved with it. Weak cultures tend not to. And then finally, they encourage ethnocentrism. Now, normally, when we talk about ethnocentrism, it's a negative thing, because it's typically adapted towards issues of race, gender, orientation, things like that. From an organizational standpoint, though, if you don't have a basic belief in your company being good, being valuable, and being, competitive and strong, you're probably not going to be wanting to stay there. If you think that where you're working is pretty much a pile of poo, then it's not going to be very interesting. You're not going to put a lot of value in it. So a strong company culture or a strong organizational culture fosters a sense of, we're actually pretty good at what we do. We want to be a market leader. We want to be the best service provider. All of those kinds of lofty goals are about the ethnocentrism of your organization and the buy-in to what you're doing as being important, quality, or whatever positive term that you want to do. So culture, this is a positive outcome of ethnocentrism, is that it helps to define who we are and say that we like who we are. So it's not to the exclusion that others can't be good. Think about your notion of school pride. Wherever you went to your undergraduate is probably one of the places that you have a stronger sense of school pride. And that wasn't that, that, well, for me, the Colorado State University is where I went for my bachelor's degree. Now, our in-state rival was the University of Colorado, the two state schools, those are the big rivalries, all that kind of good stuff. Now, we knew that the people who went to CU weren't sleazeballs, but when it came to sporting events and when it comes to talking trash about one another, we talk a lot of trash about one another. But that's part of it. It's not that we genuinely hate CU or the people from CU. That's the kind of ethnocentrism that a strong organizational culture engenders, is that you feel competitive and you feel like you want to defend your own organization. So, we're going to pause right there for the end of part 1.